Computer. Hello, and welcome to The Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian Glenn Williams. Glenn F. Williams is a retired Army officer who entered public history as a second career. He recently retired from federal civilian service as a senior historian at the U.S. Army Center for Military History, Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. A specialist in the history of colonial America and the Revolutionary War, Glenn continues to research and write, present lectures, lead tours of historic sites and battlefields for general audiences, and facilitate staff ride exercises for military leaders. Glenn earned his doctorate in history from the University of Maryland. His books include Dunmore's War, The Last Conflict of America's Colonial Era, which we're going to be talking about today, Year of the Hangman, George Washington's campaign against the Iroquois, Opening Shots in the Colonies, 1775 to 1776, which he co-authored with Jonathan Bratton, and as a contributing author for the 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution, he writes the first chapter, Campaign 1, entitled Let It Begin Here. Glenn, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you, Randy. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's talk about Dunmore's War. Glenn, what inspired you to write a book about Lord Dunmore, Virginia's royal governor?
Well, it's not actually about him, although he plays a large role in it. And my interest in it started when I was with the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, and we were working on the report to Congress about the historic preservation of sites associated with the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And I made a site visit to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with two colleagues, I being the historian. We had one guy that was doing GPS mapping and another that was doing other types of surveys. And the two engagements that occurred during the Revolutionary War at Point Pleasant were really not very much. We can talk about those later. And they do figure into my other book, Year of the Hangman. But the one that captured my attention was during Dunmore's War. And I found that battle a lot more fascinating than either of the two that happened during the Revolutionary War. And I said, gee, I got to find out more about this. And so I started doing a little more research into it. Found out it was fascinating. I like to joke when I give my lectures that this is a war that nobody's heard about, that only lasted 6 months, but somehow I wrote 400 pages on it. And it just took off from there. I did mention it in my other book, Year of the Hangman, which I wrote before Dunmore's War. And I made all the mistakes that I criticized later when I wrote Dunmore's book, the Dunmore's War book, because historians usually focused on one set of primary source information, but not another. Remember, there were two colonies involved, Pennsylvania and Virginia, and both of them had a dispute over the forks of the Ohio, which is where Pittsburgh is. And so Virginia is taking it over, claiming it's part of Virginia. Pennsylvania is resisting that. So a lot of historians, when they write about Dunmore's War, use the Pennsylvania sources, who are not going to say anything good about the Virginians, particularly Governor Dunmore. So I correct that in the second book. And then I found out it was much more than the Battle of Point Pleasant. It took over much of the frontier districts that are now parts of Pennsylvania, of course, Virginia, West Virginia, even down into what present-day Kentucky. And the Indian nations on the other side of the Ohio, particularly the Shawnees, in what's now the state of Ohio, which was where their homeland was.
Mm-hmm. Well, was Dunmore's War a legitimate military action against Indian raids, perhaps, or just another excuse for another colonial land grab?
Yeah, that's I make the mistake of calling it a land grab in the first book I wrote. In the second book, I correct that. It has to go back to the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, and also the 1768 Treaty of Hard Labor and Loch Harbor in 1770, and a separate treaty between the Cherokees and the Virginians in 1772. Now, to understand that, people always focus in on the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which essentially said that there be no settlement west of a arbitrary line drawn from the headwaters of all the rivers that flowed to the Mississippi. That was part of it. What they fail to realize is the next sentence says, "Until our further pleasure be known." And then it also says, "No further cessions of Indian land will be done except as part of a treaty negotiated by an officer of the crown, that's the only way it could be done. No more private sales of Indian land." So the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which is the one that interests us most here, moved the line open to settlement from those headwaters that flow to the Mississippi all the way to the Ohio River. Now, Fort Stanwix was negotiated by Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Northern Department, a representative of the Crown. And between him and the Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations of Iroquois, which claimed all this area as theirs by right of conquest. And they ceded everything on the south bank of the Ohio all the way to the Tennessee River. Now, who's going to oppose this? Well, the Cherokees. They're in the south. And the Treaty of Hard Labor, negotiated between Colonel John Stewart, superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern Department, representative of the Crown, and leaders of the Cherokee. So they initially redrew their line open to settlement along up to the Kanawha River, where the Kanawha flows into the Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this conflicted with the line that the Six Nations, or the Iroquois, drew. So they renegotiate the Treaty of Loch Harbor, moves it west a little bit, but still not enough to satisfy either the Iroquois or the colony of Virginia. So they finally settle on a separate treaty between Virginia and the Cherokee, sometimes called the Cherokee Grant or the Cherokee Treaty of 1772, which moves the line of settlement west to the Louisa, sometimes called the Kentucky River, and its confluence with the Ohio. So this expands the area of the colony of Virginia quite a bit. And the people that, the Six Nations of Iroquois, claiming ownership, if you will, of the area by right of conquest. They also had a colony there of Haudenosaunee called the Mingo in the area, but they claimed all the other nations there were under their dominion in one way or the other. And we can go more in detail if you want that. But they essentially told any of the Indians living on the south bank that they had to move to the north bank. Well, the Shawnees did not want to give up their hunting ground, so they're the most hostile to the British anyway at this point. So they start sending over hunting parties that get into scraps with settlers, or they send over raiding parties, and eventually the war breaks out. The war breaks out in March of 1774, when Mingos, who are friendly to the British, but some settlers, they didn't take the time to distinguish between friend and foe when it came to their Indian neighbors. So there's a group of, I'll call them border ruffians for lack of a better term, invite a group of Mingo Indians over to the south bank, a place called Baker's Bottom, where there's a tavern and a trading post. That several Indians come over. They proceed to murder them, men, women, and children. And then when their friends hear the shooting and go to see what's wrong, the skirmish continues. And in effect, several Indians are killed. The settlers, the ruffians at the time, under two brothers named Greathouse, decide, well, I think we've just started an Indian war. And so them and their followers get away from the border, know what's coming next. Some of the Indians that were killed at Baker's Bottom are the family members of a Mingo leading warrior named Logan. He decides he's going to war anyway, because Indians a lot of times went to war for revenge. He gets a group of warriors and they cross the Ohio to the south bank and raid several settlements. The Shawnees, who are itching for a fight anyway, join them, send their own raiding parties over, and the Virginia militia has to respond, first defensively, by forting up. Forting up was a process where the settlers in an area instead of just abandoning their farms, would move into a fortified home or a military installation under the protection of the militia. And then they would bring in their livestock and their families. And in the morning, they'd go out and as a group, they would go to one farmer's field, work the field while half of the men guarded them. And then they go back into the fort at night. The next day they come out to the neighbor's farm, do the same thing. That's forting up to protect them and their families instead of just abandoning their farms and letting the crops rot in the field and so forth. But the militia has to respond. So that's when we start getting into the military action.
Okay. Well, I have kind of back-to-back questions concerning the leaders. First, you had mentioned Shawnees. Um, who were some of the significant leaders? You mentioned Logan, but were there any other significant leaders of the tribal nations?
Oh yeah, the Shawnees, the largest and most powerful in the area. Their war leader was named Cornstalk. He has an Indian name, but that's how the settlers knew them, of course. And you have to understand how the Shawnees were. Their social structure was built. They were built on 4 septs, which are kind of like clans in some of the other Indian nations. And each one of these septs had a specialty. One had to do with religion and rituals. One had to do with medicine. One had to do with military. And one was political and governance. And I guess Cornstalk was the chief, the war chief, or the commander in chief of Shawnee Indian military forces from that sept that was responsible for military action. So he's the most prominent one.
Mhm. Okay. Well, on the side of basically the Virginia militia, now we know about Andrew Lewis, but tell us a little bit about Andrew Lewis and some of the other leaders of the militia, some of whom it might have been their first significant military engagement, who then went on to be real heroes in the Revolutionary
Yeah.
War.
Well, the 3 main counties on the frontier, Augusta, Baditat, and Fincastle. Andrew Lewis, of course, was the county lieutenant of Baditat County. His military experience goes back, I think, to the 1740s. He extensive experience in the French Indian War. In fact, he was in Washington's Virginia Regiment. Rose to the rank of major during the French and Indian War. The county lieutenant, Fincastle, is a Colonel William Preston. He also a veteran of the French and Indian War, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he commanded ranger companies during the French and Indian War. And Andrew Lewis's brother, Charles Lewis, the county lieutenant of Augusta County, also served in the Virginia Regiment as well as ranging companies during the course of the French and Indian War. There were other counties involved too with their county lieutenants, and we'll probably touch on them as we go on. But just some of the junior officers that took part in Dunmore's War. George Rogers Clark was a captain. Let's see. Evan Shelby, who was later figure largely into the settlement of Tennessee and Kentucky, commanded a company. And one of my favorites, William Russell, another veteran of the French and Indian War, was involved in the Battle of Point Pleasant, but he was also involved not in the Continental Army, but very active in the militia during the Revolutionary War. And William Christian, the same thing. He is the second in command of the Baditat County militia. And some of these guys would, if they weren't in the Continental Army, then they were extensive experience in the militia and were in places like the Battle of Kings Mountain, Guilford Courthouse, and so forth. So it was we tend to think of these guys as just as frontiersmen, but they participated in the militia during peacetime as well as wartime as an avocation and a civic duty. So they had highly developed military skills by the time the Revolutionary War starts.
And I guess in frontier communities, anyone who was between the ages of 16 and 60 was out like automatically a part of the militia, correct?
Yeah, I go to give talks and people come up and say, well, my great great whatever joined the militia. And I said, no, he lived in Virginia when he turned at least, but by the time he was 18, if he wasn't
Right.
already in the militia, he was in the militia when he turned 18. The law said 18, although during the Revolutionary War that was lowered to 16. But you'll find 16 and even at least one 15-year-old I mentioned in the book participating in the militia. One 15-year-old volunteered to go as a substitute with his father when his father was drafted.
Oh, okay. Well, you had mentioned that important battle of Point Pleasant. What type of fighting did the militia use? It's often thought that these frontiersmen would how do you say, fight Indian style, hit and
Yeah,
run behind rocks and trees and that type of thing. Would you clarify that the
yeah,
style of fighting?
that's one of my pet peeves. Um, I don't, the militia and frontier soldiers did not fight Indian style. Yes, they learned a lot from Indian allies as well as Indian fighting against Indian enemies, but they combined it with what was in the British Army manuals, particularly the Treatise on Military Discipline by Humphrey Bland, who writes about irregular warfare from wars in Europe, where regular forces have to contend with he called irregulars or country people in broken country. Translate that to the American woods fighting against Indians. Couldn't fight exactly Indian style because they had their own tactics, and we might get into that a little later. But basically, the militia had to open up their tactics, which basically happened a lot during the French and Indian War. The British developed their light infantry based on that too, and having to not advance. Indians fought individually when it came to a battle. They still have to maintain unit cohesion because when they tried to fight like Indians, they usually got ambushed and lost. But it would usually evolve down into units moving as units. A file, which is two soldiers that would advance together, where one was always ready to fire and the other was getting ready to fire, loading, reloading, or whatever. So, the Indians learned, like at the Battle of the Monongahela, they waited for the British to fire a volley, and then when the British were reloading, they closed in on them, and that spelled disaster a lot of times. So the Virginia troops that were with them had already caught on to this tactic, and then was just further developed into that. The Battle of Point Pleasant starts when the Indians are going to try to launch a surprise attack very early in the morning against the Virginia camp. Some people say, well, they didn't have security out. Well, that's not true. They had pickets out. But early in the morning on the 10th of October, two of the companies sent out a team of hunters each, two hunters, to supplement their army rations with game. And they run into the Indians massing for attack. One of the teams gets fired on. They were able to run back to the camp, yell the password as they're going by the picket, and run to the officer of the guard to tell them that they've seen a bunch of Indians out there in the woods to the north of them. One of the hunters gets killed, but the other one makes him back, tells the same story. The drummers beat to arms. The militia starts to assemble. Colonel Andrew Lewis calls his principal commanders together, his brother Charles and William Fleming, and tells them this is probably the biggest mistake Andrew Lewis makes in his entire military career. He tells the two colonels from the two lines, Todd County line and Augusta County line, the first 150 men who are ready to march under the command of your most reliable officers to march out from the camp to see what's in front of us. Now, Andrew Lewis thinks it's probably a scouting party, a big scouting party, but a scouting party nonetheless. So the two columns march out from the camp. The one on the right, the Augusta County line under Charles Lewis, kind of follows Crooked Creek. The other, the Todd County line, with some Fincastle County troops with him, under William Fleming, marches out from the left side of the camp, following along the Ohio River. They both get maybe half a mile north of the camp when they both are taken under fire severely. Charles Lewis is mortally wounded with the first volley as his men are deploying into line. Within seconds, William Fleming takes 3 bullets. He'll live, but he's severely wounded, and he's carried back to the camp as well. So the two lines are basically without their colonels, but they're under the command of very seasoned captains. So they try to make a solid line across the point at its narrowest point, luckily. But they still have to give ground because the Indians are just too powerful. You have, 300 militiamen, and some say between 500 and 800 Indians are attacking them. And they give ground, and the people back at the camp behind earthworks that they made with logs can see the battle going, and it's not going well. Colonel Andrew Lewis turns to Colonel John Field, who's on the expedition as a major because he raises 3 companies from Culpeper County. So he gets paid as a major, but he restores him to his colonel's rank, sends him into the battle to take over the battle up on the line to close the 2 parts of the 2 columns into one solid line. He's able to do that, but he's killed in the process. Captain Evan Shelby takes over the fight from there, and by the time the battle is fully raging, there's probably about 500, maybe 600 Virginia militiamen against between 500 and 800 Indians along the fight. Eventually, the Virginia firepower is able to be decisive, and the Indians start to retreat, and they start moving their wounded back across the river and give up the battlefield. And about that time, Virginia reinforcements show up, and the battle's over. The Virginians claim victory because they own the battlefield. They own the terrain. So under the convention of the day, they've won the battle.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Well, I know Virginia for some time had conflicts on the frontier with the Cherokees, and I guess they thought they were heading to war against the Cherokees, and they were obviously interested in Cherokee land, but they fought the Shawnees instead.
Yeah.
So historian Colin Calloway suggests that it's a war against any Indians would do. so and I know Colin, and I have interviewed him, and just a
Yeah, me too.
marvelous historian. And how do you size that up? His comment about the war against just any Indians would do.
Yeah, I first met Colin back in maybe 2002 or so, and he was a presenter at a Patriots of Color conference at the Daughters of American Revolution sponsored, and we've been on the same conference a few other times. I kind of take him to task too, because he takes a comment I make in his introduction out of context, because I say pretty much the same. It looked like the Virginians were going to go to war against the Cherokees at first. Well, there was an incident at a horse race at a fair in Fincastle County where a scuffle breaks out, and an Indian gets killed. The Cherokees claim murder. Of course, as I mentioned before, Indians a lot of times went to war for revenge. So it looked like the Cherokee were gearing up to attack settlements, and there was some skirmishing. Fincastle County calls out its militia to respond. Governor Dunmore talking to or sending messages back and forth to the county lieutenant of Fincastle County, William Preston. He and some of his subordinate officers go to the Cherokee town of Chota. They meet with 2 principal Cherokee leaders, Atakalakala, who the settlers knew as the Little Carpenter, and Oconstota. And they kind of come to an agreement where there's not going to be a general war in that part of Virginia colony. So Fincastle County demobilizes its militia, and things are quiet again for a little while until the incident I talked about occurs up at Baker's Bottom.
Mm-hmm.
That Baker's Bottom, I should have mentioned before, is on the north bank or south bank of the Ohio, across the river from where the Yellow River and the Ohio River have their confluence, and there was a Mingo hunting camp there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had mentioned, talked a little bit earlier about some of the treaties that were involving, in addition to, or after the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and you mentioned a number of treaties. What roles did the British Indian Department, and particularly the Six Nations of the Iroquois, the Cayugas, the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Tuscaroras, play in Dunmore's war?
Okay. Well, the Six Nations, or the Haudenosaunee, are the most powerful Indian polity in that part of the British colonies. They are on very good terms with the British, particularly the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. After his wife died, he takes up with a couple Indian women and fathers some children. The most famous of his Indian wives was Molly Brant, who you've probably heard about. He was adopted into the Mohawks. He was considered one of their chiefs, and he's the one that hammers out the treaty with the Haudenosaunee leaders. The Haudenosaunee, like I said, claimed everything from say the headwaters of the Susquehanna west and up to the Great Lakes, and then down the Susquehanna, then west on the Susquehanna to the Allegheny. The Allegheny turns into the Ohio, all the way down to the Tennessee River. They claimed all that territory by right of conquest, and the people there, some of them are drawn into the Confederacy, although they're not one of the Six Nations, particularly some of the bands of Delawares are considered part of the Confederacy, and some of the other smaller tribes. The Shawnee are a little different the late 17th century, during what's called the Beaver Wars. The Haudenosaunee clear out the whole area, turn it into their own hunting ground. They disperse the Shawnees in four different directions. Each of the seps goes in a different place. Some of them come up to the Susquehanna. I think there's still a town called Shawnee Springs where some of the Shawnees had resided for a while. Some go down to the south. Some think that the Suwannee River, like the song Swanee River, but Suwannee, comes because it's where one of the seps of the Shawnees settled. Some go further west towards the Mississippi. And then around right before the French and Indian War, they come back to the Ohio, and the Six Nations allow them to live there. Say that, allow them to live there.
Mm-hmm.
Which is important because although they're allowed to live on the north bank of the Ohio, they are considered under the dominion of the Six Nations. And if you read the writings of Conrad Weiser, who was an Indian agent for Pennsylvania, he says, under their dominion, for which the Shawnees mortally hate them. They hate the Six Nations. But it's the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, exerting their power over subordinate tribes that they considered part of their empire. And the Mingos, which I talked about before, are a colony, using a European term, a colony of the Six Nations on the north bank of the Ohio.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Now that we're in the midst of talking about the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and communities are developing their game plans and activities, there's a lot of discussion, of course, about when the Revolutionary War began. And so Point Pleasant is certainly one of those items that are brought up from time to time. So uh, what do you think about the Battle of Point Pleasant? Should it be considered the first real battle of the Revolutionary War?
Absolutely not. You had Virginia militia that was called into service by who? The royal governor
Right.
of the colony of Virginia. If you read their primary sources, letters between militia officers, they usually end with a salutation, "In His Majesty's service." If you read a doggerel poem written by one of the soldiers who was at Point Pleasant, he is talking about doing it for the honor of King George III.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not. In this period, late 1774, we still are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. Not yet rebellion, much less revolution, or even much more or less about independence. We're talking about the colonies are still loyal, maybe with some exceptions, those hotheads up in Boston. But basically, the colonies are still loyal. Yes, there are questions about the role of Parliament versus the role of the colonial assemblies and how they work together with both looking at the king as the ultimate magistrate of Britain, but say in Virginia, the colonial council sitting in the place of the House of Lords, the House of Burgesses sitting in the place of the House of Commons. Where do laws that have to do with raising revenue have to start? In Parliament or in even the U.S. government, they have to start in the lower house, which is composed of representatives of the people. The people, say, of Virginia thought the only way they could be taxed is with their own consent or those of their elected representatives, the House of Burgesses. So when Patrick Henry says taxation without representation, he's talking about the representative and the Burgesses, not people in the House of Commons in England. So that's the rub, and that's part of the argument. And there are petitions that go back and forth, and a lot of the
Sure.
problems that stem off of that come from that dispute.
One of the questions you just popped into my mind that I think we need to address is in the aftermath of the Battle of Point Pleasant, a treaty was signed, and Dunmore was developed that with Cornstalk. But could you address not only that treaty, but in the aftermath of that, some of the groups that had fought, the militias that had fought, had also got together and they passed some resolves. Could you
Sure,
address those two things, the treaty with Dunmore with the Native Americans, and then the resolves that were passed?
sure. Well, after Point Pleasant, you have to understand the Virginia Army was divided into two divisions, one moving with Colonel Andrew Lewis, fought the Battle of Point Pleasant. They crossed the Ohio. They meet another group that was traveling with Dunmore. They come down the Ohio up the Hockhocking Creek, and they both meet near the Pecaway Plains, just outside the main Shawnee principal village of Chillicothe, and they build a fortified camp called Camp Charlotte. Cornstalk, after the Battle of Point Pleasant, his only chance of winning was to defeat those two wings of the Virginia Army, what in military terms we call in detail, one and then the other. Not able to do that. So now he's looking at 800 warriors facing 2,500 Virginia militiamen. So he tells his fellow chiefs that we have two options. We can either destroy Chillicothe and our cornfields ourselves, kill all our families, and then attack Camp Charlotte because we know we're going to lose, or we can ask for peace terms. He goes to ask for peace terms, and the terms are unbelievably lenient offered by Dunmore. They're required to give up no other land on the north bank of the Ohio, no land on the north bank of the Ohio. The Shawnees have to recognize the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which makes the boundary between their land and Virginia, the Ohio River. They have to return all the prisoners or captives they took in their raids. They have to return all the horses they took in their raids. They have to allow Virginia traders to come into their towns. Before this, they preferred Pennsylvania traders, but Dunmore says, no, you have to accept Virginia traders as well. They have to open up the Ohio River to commerce again. And this is only an armistice. The armistice is to last until March. In March, Cornstalk is to either himself or some of his principal chiefs meet with Virginia Indian commissioners in Pittsburgh to hammer out the final treaty the following March. And in return, the Shawnees have to give up 6 hostages. Now, hostages had to be their chiefs or sons of chiefs. Now, don't think of these like we think of people being taken hostage like October 7th. These are kind of like collateral. They are not bound. They are not prisoners. They go there. They go to Williamsburg on their own power, not under escort, not under guard. They live in Williamsburg, freedom of the city and everything else. It's just so to make sure that the Indian chiefs from the Shawnee Nation will show up for the final treaty in March. So that is the terms. Now, the constitutional crisis is heating up. While the men are on the expedition that results in these treaties and the Battle of Point Pleasant, there is a false rumor that makes it to a lot of colonial papers that the British have fired on Boston and destroyed Boston, and this sets a lot of people off in the other colonies, and particularly the soldiers in Virginia. Now, as the northern wing of Dunmore's army is marching back home when the armistice is reached, stop at Fort Gower, which is on the north bank of the Ohio, is a supply depot and a fort that the northern branch to the army established. And they decide that if there is going to be a war, if the British insist on imposing their power, and we can get into which of the coercive acts they opposed most, if that does come to a war, yes, we are loyal subjects of the king, but if we have to fight the British army, we will. It's pretty much what the Fort Gower resolve says. And then they continue to march home. The real first battle of the Revolutionary War is, as everybody knows, is coming up on the 19th of April, 1775, is the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where British troops fire on Massachusetts militiamen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that explanation, because I think it's really important in the aftermath of, obviously, Point Pleasant and in discussions we've had. What happened to the Shawnee chief Cornstalk? He played a major role in not only the treaty but the Dunmore's War. What happened to him?
Well, he's seen as an honorable enemy. He had fought the settlers during the French and Indian War. In fact, led some pretty devastating raids on some of the settlements, like in the Greenbrier Valley of Virginia. But the aftermath of Dunmore's War is pretty significant in that the frontier is relatively quiet from 1774 to 1777. 1777 is when the British Indian Department, along with the four of the Six Nations of Iroquois, which side with the British, try to bring in all those tribes they consider under their dominion into the war on the side of the British, including offensive action. And in 1777, when news gets down to that part of the Ohio, the Shawnees decide to come into the war with offensive action on the side of the British. Being the honorable man he was, Cornstalk and another of the Shawnee chiefs goes to the fort that the Virginians had built on the site of the Battle of Point Pleasant, and called Fort Randolph by then, to let Captain Matthew Arbuckle, who's the commander of the fort, who was also at the Battle of Point Pleasant, know that the next time they meet, they might be on opposite sides of the battlefield. Well, sometimes during the meeting, there were also militiamen assigned to the fort, in addition to the regulars that were the regular garrison. And one of them gets killed and scalped, and his body is found by some of his buddies. So they're enraged, and they immediately blame Cornstalk, and they murder Cornstalk and the other chief and Cornstalk's son. Matthew Arbuckle tries to maintain order. He charges those who killed Cornstalk and the others, sets them for court-martial. The problem is none of the buddies who were witnesses were willing to testify that that's what happened. And of course, they end up going unpunished. But Cornstalk, of course, is killed and buried there at Point Pleasant.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, Glenn, for our last question, what should readers take away from this book? What's the one thing that they should remember, if nothing else?
If nothing else, that was a very turbulent time. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in 1774, although the coercive acts had become in place, the constitutional crisis between the American colonists and the British government had not risen to the point of arms yet. Second, that treaties were always being made, and one of them reestablished the Royal Proclamation Line. The Royal Proclamation Line was not the last word in westward expansion at this time, and that's the Treaty of Fort Stanwix reset that boundary. And that I think if I say anything else, we have a tendency to make the Indians victims all the time. We have to realize that nations, including the Indian nations, always act in their own interest. They felt that they still had they were entitled to hunt on the south bank of the Ohio, and this is mainly a clash of cultures. So you have the settlers on one side and the Indians on the other. Say an Indian hunting party crosses the Ohio to hunt as they always had. You have settlers that move in and what they called improve land. And what does improve mean? Clear out some of the trees, put around fences, plow fields, bring in domesticated animals. The Indians come on thinking they're hunting. The grass has been cut down, some of the foliage is gone, so the deer have become scarce, but they see a cow, so they kill the cow. And then to spend the night, they have to build a fire. So the trees are gone, but there's a pike rail fence. So they tear down the fence to build their fire. Now they have to take the carcass of the cow back to their town. It's too heavy to carry individually, but hey, there's a horse. So they load it up and they go back to their town. So they're hunting the way they think they've always hunted, just adapting to the new environment. What does the settler think? Well, they've trespassed on my property. They've destroyed my fence, they killed my cow, and they stole my horse. So these types of things get the clash of cultures that begins the war, that results in the war, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Well, Glenn, thanks so much for joining me today. It's a fascinating discussion about your book, Dunmore's War. Sure. And so hopefully we can get you back again.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Well, to our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian Glenn Williams, author of Dunmore's War, The Last Conflict of America's Colonial Era, available wherever books are sold. My name is Randy Flood. Join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian on the real American Revolution. So long for now.